Okay, today we're picking up already into chapter 9, bottom of page 99, and then we're going on to page 100. There's many themes or facets to every one of these encounters or these chapters, and there's no way we could cover them all. But I wanted to focus on two in this chapter to go into, and I think tonight I'll just do one, which has to do with the sitting meditation practice, which is what's coming up here in the first part. And then I'll wait till next week till I get some more stillness or insight or something and take on the question of birth and death or nirvana, which is the other one that comes up here. Now I could jump into that nirvana thing right away, but I think it'd be a little bit like, what's his name? Shen Hui. Remember Shen Hui, the little boy? The master said, this is on your page 97, he said to the community, I have something with no head or tail, no name, no label, no back or front. Do you know what it is? And Shen Hui stepped forward right away and said, it's the root and source of all Buddhas, my Buddha nature. And the master said, I just told you it had no name or label, and you immediately go call it the root of all Buddhas. Go and build a thatched hut over your head. You're just an intellectual pretending to know. So I thought, if I take on nirvana and birth and death, I could be like Shen Hui, just sticking my neck out. So give me a week to prepare myself, to have my thatched hut built just in case I go south on this one. But it's appropriate to say that because the idea of birth and death, or samsara, nirvana, and what nirvana is, falls into the same line of what Shen Hui was scolded for, trying to get at it or try to express it just intellectually. And yet, although you can't, and I can't, and it said, even the Buddha said he couldn't express it or explain it in words and language, nonetheless we can discuss it by using words and language to get to the point where, as far as words and language can take, there's an expression in this tradition that if you cultivate sincerely Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, precepts, this concentration, and develop your wisdom nature, you can get to the path, you can use the path and words and language to get to where the path and words and language stops. And then you can go beyond that. And what this means is that the teachings or the theory and the words and language are not inadequate per se, nor even superfluous and not necessary, but they can't go all the way. And one of the texts that we're reading recently says this has to be seen and not just known. It has to be seen directly. And by seen, they mean that your whole mind-body phenomena, when calmed and when brought to this point, the text says, realizes it internally. That's the language that's used. It's realized internally and not just grasped externally, or even able to be expressed in words, but that doesn't mean there's nothing. So I'm going to wait till next week till I get a little more under my belt here before I go into that realm. But I'm going to start tonight with a corresponding notion that'll feed into it. And this is on the bottom of 99. We're in this section where the master has refused to go to the palace to instruct the empress, or the ruling dowager at that time, and her husband. And so they send this minister, a chamberlain, to inquire. And he asks his first question. He says, the worthy Chan, the Dhyana or Zen masters of the capital city, all say the same thing. They all say one must sit in Chan meditation and practice concentration to gain an understanding of the way. For without that concentration, liberation isn't possible. I wonder what is your teaching? So the Chamberlain comes with, it's funny, it's strange in the sense that if he really believed that that was the only case, why would he be asking this question? I never thought about that. If he really accepted what that was being said by these Chan masters, why would he then question it? So obviously the Sixth Patriarch will probably pick up on his concern with why that wouldn't be the case, or why he has doubts about it. And I mean, anybody, if you thought about why would there be any doubts of sitting meditation? I mean, if you just look at so much of the statuary, I mean, just turn your heads, look at the back wall, there's a picture of the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, and it looks to me like he's sitting in meditation. You can see many of the icons in statuary and show Buddhas in sitting meditation posture. And so why would he be asking this question, such a prevalent part of the Buddhist tradition? Why would he even have any doubts about it? Sort of rhetorical, but it's also if anybody wants to. Or do you have any questions about why you would sit in sitting meditation? What's the value and usefulness of it? I mean, if you say to most people, Buddhism or I'm a Buddhist or whatnot, I'm sure within 5 frames of mind, sitting in meditation is one of the images they come up with. I don't know what else, maybe, probably sitting meditation is the big one, right? Bathing the Buddha, maybe? What images come up when you say? Huh? Chanting, yeah, sometimes chanting is associated. So chanting, sitting meditation. Bowing, yeah. But I would say sitting meditation, especially in the modern mind in the West, that seems to be the number one image. Well, let's see. How he answers the question sometimes indicates where he's picking up the question is coming from. The master answers, he said, the way is realized through the mind. How could it come from sitting? The Vajra Sutra, the Diamond Sutra says, if you claim that the Tathagata either sits or lies down, you're traveling in a wrong path. Why? Because he neither comes from anywhere nor goes anywhere. Freedom from birth and death is the Tathagata's pure Chan meditation. The still emptiness of all things is the Tathagata's pure Chan sitting. Ultimately, there's no realization, how much less sitting. Ooh, this is, yeah, this is very terse. May or may not be what Shui Jian, this Chamberlain, was expecting. But let's look at the first part. He's saying the way, and by this, it's just an expression for enlightenment or awakening, or the Buddha way, the path that leads to awakening, is realized through the mind, through the understanding, unbinding, purification, liberation of the mind. And of course, by this, it means all your faculties. This mind that's being talked about is not simply, it's not the brain for sure, although it includes the brain, but it's including consciousness itself and all the forms that manifest in the mind-body continuum. So he's saying if it's realized, or as the other text says, internally realized, how could it come from just sitting for long periods of time and crossing the legs? So he's posing back a question to him. And then he uses the Vajra Sutra to illustrate his point. If you claim the Tathagata, another title for a fully awakened being, thus come one or thus gone one, either sits or lies down, you're traveling on a wrong path. In other words, if you look, this is part of the Vajra Sutra where the Buddha is saying to Subhuti in this sutra, awakening, or what is realized in this perfecting of the human spiritual potential, is not found in marks, in appearances. It doesn't have appearances. And so he says, if you look for the Tathagata insights, or you listen for that Tathagata through your ear or through sounds, you'll never find the Tathagata. You walk a crooked path and will never find the thus come one. I'm quoting you the Vajra Sutra. So Subhuti's wondering then, well, then how does one get it or whatnot? And basically the Tathagata is saying you don't need to get it. It's already whole and complete. You've simply covered it over with your confused thinking and your grasping and attaching, including grasping and attaching at marks and appearances, wanting to get something. And so he kind of pulls the rug again and goes back to this fundamental teaching. So here's why he's claiming the same thing in this passage. And then he says, why? Because neither comes from anywhere and goes from anywhere. In other words, basically saying it's already whole and complete. There's nothing to seek. There's nothing to get. Simply awaken to what's already present. Now you see this teaching way in the beginning of this chapter. In the chapter it says where it all began, which in your text is page 7. And here in his first teaching to the assembly, he says, good and wise friends, awakening or bodhi or enlightenment is just the purity of your own nature. Attend only to this and you will straightway achieve Buddhahood. I mean, that's his opening line. So he's basically saying the same thing. He's quoting the Vajra Sutra here. That this is internally present, always available, although not always activated or cultivated. But it's your own nature. It's nothing outside. And moreover, although that's the case, then the only way you get to Buddhahood is by attending to that, paying attention to that. This is where, where mindfulness could apply if you want to use that term. But mindfulness means attending to that essential nature. How is it that when I say something, I do something, I think something, I either stay within that matrix of that pure, awakened, unattached state, or I move out of it? And the attending to it is to watch and understand the mind as it moves in and out, until finally you get a regulation or a letting go that allows regulation to take place by itself, where you're always in a state of not leaving this. So this is where it's going, so that the attending to this is really tough work, because you're having to watch over your 6 sense organs as they're constantly interchanging with sense objects, and the attachments, projections, identities, fears and desires that you're layering on top of that. And that's sometimes they call it the narrative movie. In this text, it's called dream. This is called dreaming. So in that sense, the dream is our bottom line of where we're coming from, and that's why Bodhi means awakening from the dream. Bodhi doesn't mean a quest to get something outside or to score a mystical state, but simply means waking up from the dream. And that's what attending to this means. But as the texts say, that the dream is extremely powerful. The way that consciousness gets habituated and formed day to day, week to week, life to life, is a deep paradigm. It's a deep contours. And just as when you have those contours in the earth, when rain comes, the water just gradually goes to those places again and just flows through it. In the same way, once those contours are set up in that way, all that we experience and know just start flowing into those contours, and we get, what a modern scientist might call paradigm paralysis. We get stuck in a particular mindset of which it's almost impossible to get out of. So this might give us a little hint about what a meditation is about. It's not to get a mystical state of transcendence, but to attend to this, more carefully attend to this, and maybe train us in a way that attends to this more carefully. But in and of itself, and this is where he's going, it will not lead to Bodhi. It will not bring Bodhi. So this is, because he's saying, it comes through the mind, how can it come from sitting? So he's pushing back. I think it's important to put out here, I don't think, maybe you can all weigh in on this, I don't think the Sixth Patriarch is saying here, you don't need to sit, or that sitting isn't necessary. I think more he's saying it's just sitting alone is not it. That's how I take it. How could it come from sitting? So he's saying maybe it can't come from sitting, but he's not saying you shouldn't sit. You want to jump to that conclusion, but he's trying to show something about sitting meditation that has a deeper dimension to it, and if you don't access that, the sitting goes nowhere. Freedom from birth and death is Tathagata's pure Chan meditation. So now he's saying what the Chan or meditation is for an enlightened being is the freedom from involuntary samskaric existence, going on, driven by passions, confusion, and whatnot. The freedom from that, which is, if you think about it, the total mind-body liberation. It's not simply something that's brought about by crossing the legs and concentrating. It'd have to be a total transformative event. Yeah, if you think about it, because otherwise, anything that's short of that, you'd still be subject to that condition on and off, on and off. So, and now that's the one I want to go into next week, the birth and death one. And the still emptiness of all things is the Tathagata's pure sitting. Meaning, I think what he's saying here is that basically the fundamental nature of all things is emptiness, sunyata, which means they have no self-nature of their own. They're merely existing in a co-conditioned arising and changing and whatnot. So this is very different than most people think of sitting. And he says, therefore, how can there is no realization, how much less sitting? In other words, using other words to get at words that are almost impossible to get at. I just realized what I did there. Sitting directed at a goal of realization is misplaced, is what he's saying here. But he's not saying that sitting is off and wrong. So, Shuizhen's response was, when I return to the palace, their majesties will surely question me. It's like, so you're the chamberlain, right? And you come and ask this question, and you just write this down, and you go back, and rulers being less than awakened or enlightened. I know Plato has the idea of the philosopher king, but, at this time and probably in the present, they're rare to find. They're like unicorns, really sagely enlightened presidents and prime ministers. So probably, they wouldn't get this paragraph, and the chamberlain would be, here it is, that's what he said, and they might go, with a certain threat of their voices, and so what the hell does that mean? Explain it for us, because we sent you all this distance to make offerings, and this is what you're coming back with, this riddle? So please unpack it for us. And at that point, I think he already realized where he's going. He says, if I return, they will question me. Please, Master, be so kind as to instruct me on the essentials of the mind, so that I can pass it along to the two rulers and students of the way in the capital. So he's saying, okay, I'll accept what you said, that it is about cultivating the mind and not just sitting but what does that mean? What does it mean to cultivate the mind? So I can pass it along to the two rulers and the students of the way in the capital. It will be like one lamp lighting 100,000 lamps, light upon light without end illuminating the darkness. So you know how that works. If you have a candle with and you light another one, and then it lights another one, lights another one. It's a beautiful image, but I think he's kind of waxing a bit poetic here, almost, playing up to the master. If you light my candle, I'll go back to the capital and light some others, is what he's saying. And you're really a big bonfire here, and then we'll have light everywhere. Please, so help me out here. And so the master will come back with his reply. But just to pause here a little bit, I want to maybe go into this a bit about the sitting meditation practice. The basic ground of this teaching is really interesting. It's making a couple of claims that I think can be expressed pretty straightforwardly. I think the one position it is that the ordinary ways we conduct ourselves and live and think and move is, as I said, and the text say, is dreamlike. We're unaware. We don't see the ramifications of our thoughts and our actions. We don't ponder deeply where it is we're coming from or where we might be going or what to make of this brief interval in between. I mean, the texts go on quite explicitly to describe that we're like swimming in a sea where there's a storm, and we momentarily come up and grasp some air, and then a wave comes in, and we swallow water, come down, and we're back up again. And it's not just this way life to life, it's this way day to day. Other texts describe it quite well. My favorite is Cow Mountain, which describes this idea of how day to day, the better part of our nature gets chiseled and carved away, and at the end of the day, we doubt that we're really even fully human and could go on, and yet we get replenished, and it happens again and again. So why is this? And this is talking about that state of mind that's undisciplined and unreflected upon, and that's a result. So the first premises or the first statement is that our common ways or our common modes of thinking and living and considering and behaving, and our habitual ways, the habits that then make that reflexive, are absolutely upside down. And this is a word in Chinese, it's diandao. And it's called upside down dream thinking, right out of the Heart Sutra. In other words, instead of being right side up, we're upside down, and we're sleeping upside down like bats, I suppose. That's the closest image. Hanging upside down where we should be upside up, right side up and awake, but we're upside down and asleep. So this is the first description that's given. And this upside downness is, in Sanskrit, it's called avidya, and literally not seeing clearly. We're seeing, but we're not seeing clearly. It doesn't mean we're blind. It means we're seeing in a distorted way. The second part of this is that is the ordinary condition of what they call living beings, us sentient beings, most of the time. The second part is that if you can harness your mental and physical capacities, your faculties, in a very inspired and informed, trained way, you can reverse this upside downness. You can get right side up. You can go from avidya to what's called prajna, or wisdom, for want of a better translation, but truly seeing the nature of everything. And what's expressed here is liberation. Liberation ultimately from this thing called birth and death, which I'm not going to do, I said tonight, so I'm not going to go off on that one. Just let's leave that, I was going to say leave that hanging, but that's not it. Leave that to the side of saying it's talking about a awakening and a liberation from the absolute uncertainty and vicissitudes of conditioned existence and the dukkha or the sufferings associated with that. So if we know that everything around us is fleeting and changing and permanent, and no matter how hard we try to get a handle on it, including ourselves and our own lives, is constantly subject to change and flux and is deteriorating. Everything comes into being, dwells, goes bad, finally gone. This too. That anxiety, or you call stress or dukkha, that comes from the result of that is a kind of chain or an enslavement. And it really does take possession of us. The Buddha said it takes possession of us even if we try to deny it, because it won't go away by denying. And so that being that underlying condition of anxiety and stress is said to end with nirvana. Okay? Now I just want to be clear what that is. And it's said to bring about a profound purity, permanence, true self, and bliss. That is the opposite of that. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail tonight because it really requires more unpacking. But what I wanted to stress here is it isn't the ending of existence. I just want to because sometimes people, every time, you hear Liao Sheng Tosa, you come to the monastery and people say, turn the Dharma wheel to teach us how to Liao Sheng Tosa, end birth and death. And some people, mostly nobody really thinks, what does that mean? But certainly it doesn't mean to not be, okay? It probably means something more like being in a totally different way that's free of suffering and free of anxiety and free of confusion. But let me just pose that for tonight, because otherwise this would seem like he's talking about some kind of extinction or nihilism, and that's what you're aiming for in the meditation. So then that's the second one. The third one says the harnessing of that mental and physical faculties is what's called self-cultivation. And this is at the heart of Buddhism. It isn't really about the theory per se, although that's very important. It's about actually harnessing the mental and physical. That means you have to become skillful and masterful over what you're saying, your words, over what you're doing with your body, and more importantly, with your emotions, thoughts, and internal movements that don't have necessarily any corresponding external. And these three, body, mouth, and mind, are called the three karmas, the three vehicles of intentional action that we then live by, body, mouth, and mind. And so when it says harnessing those, it means you really have to be aware of where that thought, where that word, where that impulse is coming from, whether or not it's wholesome or unwholesome to give into it or hold it or restrain it, and a sensitivity of where it goes when it's out and done or not. So that kind of mindfulness is, you can see it's not just sitting in meditation. This requires a 24/7 kind of alertness. The third premise of this is, and so the first one is, we have our common modes and habitual ways are upside down and confused. We can get out of that through this harnessing of self-cultivation. And then the last one, this method is across all text. It has some combination to do with clearing up your ideas and getting a good theory, a grounded theory of how to go about practicing. But the theory part means the study. You actually have to, and it's encouraged to look at these texts, to look at the commentaries, to look at the Abhidharma, and to try to philosophically, in a deep philosophical way, like engaged philosophy, not just abstract philosophy. Philosophy in the meant that it was meant to be a way of living. Philosophy as a way of life. You take on this philosophy as if this is your core of making sense of things. And you study this and you get to know this, which then gives you a kind of orientation to how you might go about living. It isn't living per se, as much as you cogitate on it, but it does give you some hypothetical ground by which to then experiment and embody it. And then the text says, so you've got to have that. But then you have to, and it's very interesting, analysis, they say, only goes so far. And once you have that analysis down, you have to make the next step. And the next step is, you find this interesting if you're into the languages, because sometimes they use the word prajna, sometimes you use the word jnana, sometimes this is translated as meditation. And I'm going to resist that, because I don't think that that's what it actually means, although it's represented as meditation practice. Okay, so let me come back to that a little more. It's sometimes called Chan or Shamatha Vipassana. So analysis and Shamatha Vipassana, which gets translated as meditation. But I'm saying, unless we really deeply go into this text, we'll think that it's just crossing our legs and sitting like he does, and we have to understand it ain't just that. Meditation is much, much more than just crossing the legs. It's like uncrossing the mind, and then you can cross the legs. But if you don't uncross the mind, crossing the legs will just get you a lot of pain and mentally more affliction. So let me go into this in some detail. When you look at a Buddha image, and these are handed down through the ages, as kind of markers for us to look at. When you look at the image, my teacher pointed me to the image of a Buddha sitting in meditation to begin my meditation practice. Just do what he's doing. That's all he said. Now, it wasn't just because I didn't speak Chinese, and that's the only English he knew. I think there was more method to that than I initially thought. And so I just looked at the image and crossed my legs. And then I remembered before I came to the monastery, when I was in graduate school, and I encountered these things, I thought, I'm going to go get enlightened, and I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go in the mountains and sit in meditation. So that's what I did. I went in the mountains. And it was hard because you look at the image, it's like, oh, wait a minute. He's not like just sitting on a chair. He's sitting on his butt. And he's got his legs, whoa, I got that. And I started to do that, and I realized, whoa, this is very hard. This is very hard. And even when I got to that position, I didn't look like he looked. I didn't look like, I was like stressed out and squirming and wiggling. And I actually thought, I've been cheated. This is not an accurate image. Nobody can do this. And I realized over time what my teacher was saying when he said, do what he's doing, he was pointing me not to just the external, but the internal. And I just took it as the external. And I realized, for this image to convey its centeredness, its emotional freedom and lightness of being, and total freedom from desires and anxiety and stress, which is what the image is conveying, I'm going to have to do a little more than just crossing my legs. And that took me into what's called the mind ground. And I realized that was a mess, a total mess. And then I had to come back to the texts. And the texts are very interesting because they give many examples about this. And so let me go where I'm trying to get tonight, briefly saying that sitting meditation in this tradition is a totally integrated mind-body harnessing of faculties towards the elimination of klesha. And by klesha, the Sanskrit term means the elimination of both mental and emotional and even physical impediments to total awakening, which is your ideas, your opinions, your thoughts, and a lot of negative emotions like envy, jealousy, pride, lust, and so on and so forth. And that's what sitting meditation is. It's that combined effort. And the posture basically is only to try to get you to stay in one place long enough to address that. Okay? It isn't, and it won't by itself do it, because there has to be a kind of brutal honesty by which you go into that place to do that. So that's why Jiri, a great meditation master of the Tiantai tradition, said that you need the analysis and you need the theory, but you also need to then apply it to yourself and do the cleansing. He said it's like you can't wash your hands with one hand. You can hold the soap and you can do that, but you have to do this. He says you have to have the study analysis and you have to have the contemplation, or I will call contemplative cleansing. I'm not going to say, because I say contemplation, one of the earliest translations is trance. Oh yeah, they enter trances, and it's still used. I still see books out today where they talk about Buddhist meditation as trances. They're not trances. At least when I say to Westerners what a trance is, you think hypnotic trance, right? You think of zoning out. If the CHP pulls you over and says, like, are you in a trance? That means you weren't paying attention, right? It doesn't mean trance. Actually, meditation means getting out of the trance. It's the opposite. So that's why it's called awakening. It's not called trance. And you're not zoning out. You're tuning in. You're hyper-tuning in to body, mouth, and mind as it's moving. So that's why Jiri says these two together work. We just came across the use of rice in the text, and this is some of these metaphors are really interesting. The Shurangama Sutra uses the rice metaphor. Now everybody here, I assume, is familiar with rice. Not just the kind you throw at weddings, but you actually cook it and eat it, that kind? Everybody's cooked rice? Even instant rice, you have to cook it, okay. So, or nuke it in the way, whatever. But rice grains as they come out are hard. And they're really hard to chew. So one of the texts says, if you try to do meditation practice, which is the contemplative practice, without the necessary third, it's like a tripod, without the other leg, which is the cleansing, the klesha cleansing, the purification. It is like getting sand and cooking it, hoping to get rice. So this is very interesting. It said, and you can cook it, and you can cook it, and you can add all kinds of spices, and you can do everything, but it's still going to be sand at the end. It won't be rice. So there it's saying, not only is it a complementary, it's an absolute sine qua non. It's an absolute essential that you have the klesha cleansing purification going on with your sitting practice, or you're just cooking sand, hoping to get rice. So like, wow, okay. The other one text is very interesting. He said, if you study the text in a kind of just scholarly way, or you study the text just to memorize them, and don't understand that they're pointing to this internal realization mechanism by the cleansing, the example there is given, it's like giving uncooked rice to kids. And they'll try to chew on chop it, but they'll never get the nutritional value of the flavor. So the idea is that study like that in and of itself is just like having uncooked rice. What good is it? Now, I have a friend who uses uncooked rice in bags for her meditation. How? She puts them on her legs to bring her legs down when she's sitting in lotus to give the position. That's okay. But go back to the metaphor. It's not okay to take the teachings and not understand what they're pointing to. In this same text, this metaphor is actually from the Lankavatara Sutra, right? Remember? Oh, well, Lankavatara Sutra. And then the Lankavatara Sutra says, so if you give children this uncooked rice, cultivators of the way, if they don't get at what the texts are pointing to, it's just like chewing on that. And then the next metaphor is really fun because I'd always heard about the finger pointing to the moon, and I couldn't figure, where does it come? It comes from the Lankavatara. And then it said in that text, if you use your finger to, let's say, point to that light, that's the moon. But if you focus your attention on the tip of the finger, saying, and when I say, look at what I'm doing, and you go, and you pick on the point, but you don't look what it's pointing to, it's in the same way as the uncooked rice. You will not get to where it's going. You're mistaking the fingertip focus for where it's pointing to. So these are all metaphors to sort of talk about, first of all, how you have to have these things together, but that, and without them together, you won't get anything. But even having together, you have to do it in a very, very sophisticated way to understand what this is about and why you're doing it, and then understand the klesha cleansing and so forth. So when I first came from that experience of sitting on my own and realizing I didn't know what I was doing, I had no understanding, much less harness on my mind and my emotions, and when I was sitting alone like that, so when I came into the monastery, one of my goals was to get instruction on sitting. And before I could get instruction on sitting, I was taught to pay attention to my klesha, which at that point I thought, I don't have any. I'm living a pretty easy life. I've given up most things. I've just come here to cultivate, and what klesha could I possibly have? I'm very close to awakening right now. Just give me some technique on the sitting. And so the teaching I got was, oh, by the way, that's arrogance, huh? That notion you have of being already close, and so forth. And at that time I was ABD. Everybody know what is ABD?
All but dissertation.
Yeah, it means all but dissertation. So I've been studying, and I was pretty smart. It could mean all but done too. That's, all but dissertation, all but done. And for me, at this case, it was all but dead. ABD, because not dead in the sense I was tired of it, but also dead because it had numbed me to anything below my shoulders. I mean, I was totally in my head, totally in my fantasies, and totally in myself. And so when I came in, the master at that time just pointed my arrogance, and wow. And I had no idea that I was even arrogant. I've told you this before. And his teaching was, how are you going to get liberated and awaken when you can't even understand how you've tied yourself up and you're asleep? And basically quoted the Shrangama, said, in order to untie a knot, you have to understand how you tied it in the first place. And so it was like, wow. So my first 3 years was not spent sitting meditation, but bowing. Because bowing is a practice that is meant to get at pride and arrogance. And the master I told you about, Juri, who was a great meditation teacher, spent the first 20 years of his cultivation doing bowing and repentance. It's not sitting meditation. And so it's like, all of a sudden this brings us back to the point that meditation in this tradition is really fundamentally built upon the klesha cleansing exercises. That has to be at the heart of it. Now what happens is, if you know that, you can start sitting. As you sit, it will point to your klesha. It will draw them up. It's really, if you, of course, if you don't think you have any, then it'll block it. And that's called arrogance. Well, arrogance is mana. And in Sanskrit, sometimes abhimana. But it means that you have an inflated fullness, not based on confidence, but based on false attachments and grabbing what's perishable and thinking this is me and mine. So there's no place for anything to fit, which is how my teacher said. He said, you're so full of yourself, there's no place for the teaching to go. There's no place for light to even come in. And then he gave this expression, people who are like this think, I alone am awakened, others are confused. I alone am pure, others are defiled. I alone am sober, others are drunk. He says, with this view, you have no place for anything to enter, therefore you can't change, you can't grow, because you think you're already full. So the bowing, in a sense, is the emptying out of that attachment. So what I was going back to is, if you start the meditation practice and you understand the theory that, in fact, the meditation should bring light and energy to your chemistry, sort of your spiritual chemistry, and with that light you'll be able to see your mind ground. And you'll be able to start to unpack what's there. And that's to be expected. So good meditation in the beginnings is very much not blissful awakening. It's just like going down into the basement with all the cobwebs and dust and dirt on a hot day, right? And you don't even have a vacuum cleaner. You just have a toothbrush and and you're going to clean up the basement. And by noon it's getting hotter, right? And you do this all day long, and you've got a square inch you've cleaned up. Next day you go again and again. And it's only in that way that klesha turns into bodhi. It's transformed. So what I was saying is, when you meditate, if you expect and know that the early stages are just going to reveal how neglected and overcovered everything is, you won't get disappointed and think, oh, it's not working. It's actually working really well. And then meditation can advance, I think, in the way that Hui Neng is talking about it. You can actually then use sitting meditation effectively as a mind-cleansing, clarifying, liberating thing, because you're not seeking anything. What you're trying to do is to watch and catch where you've tied yourself up, where the dirt arises, and catch it, remove it, catch it, remove it. And that's a different approach to meditation. But eventually, in that process of doing that, it starts to lead to these kinds of states that are the clarity and the awakening. So I just wanted to maybe share that a little bit. Maybe you have any questions on that. That was the Chan sitting I was trying to point to. And I think, I don't know, but at least in the 60s when I started, 1960s for, this was not at all clear to us. What I just explained tonight was not at all clear to us. There was either the idea that you went off to graduate school and studied Buddhism, and that was still just catching on then. In the mid-60s, it was starting to take off, and so you'd go to a school and learn Sanskrit, Pali, Japanese, Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese, And you go into these texts and you pretty much approach it the same way you approached any of the social studies, humanities courses with all those markers and modes. Or you just went and sat someplace in meditation. So there's really two schools, and they look down on each other. The school that just practiced said, oh, you're all caught up in books and language and words, you'll never get there, ha, ha, ha. And the other people who were doing the Buddhist studies thing, well, you don't even understand nirvana. It comes from this and comes from that. You're completely confused. You think it's this and that. So they would look down on the people that are practicing. People that are practicing look down on the people that studied. And Juri's whole point was, you got to bring these two together. Not the two people, but the two states of mind like this. This hasn't gone away. This was in Juri's time. It was existing in the time of the Buddha. And I'd argue it's still going on, this bifurcation. So I'm just bringing this out tonight to say he is not criticizing sitting meditation, but he's saying sitting meditation, when done properly, is the total transformation of your whole being. And therefore, it could be considered real Chan sitting meditation, but it's not just sitting. Does that work a little bit? Make sense? I sort of take it for granted, but everybody knows this by now. But every time I go out and give a talk or something, invariably this split occurs and people bring it up and wonder about it. And looking for special states in their sitting meditation to have visions or auditory or visual changes of consciousness, or signs that they're doing well because they see statues or hear voices. Or contrary, where they feel like sitting meditation is completely entering an oblivious state where you're not, you don't have to deal with the world in any way, and they just sort of withdraw deeper and deeper. Or on the other hand, people that are just into intellectual Buddhism, and you don't see any transformation of the person or character, although you see a great acquisition of knowledge. But the fundamental shift, the transformation of the person, the personality isn't occurring. So it's getting these two in balance is really tough. Anyhow, enough for tonight. Next week I will try to do the birth and death one, and maybe bring some passages to try to illustrate this, because I think that one's really important to get at as much as possible that we can do it. Any questions? No one's got questions?
I have one. I can understand becoming aware of certain patterns in the mind. So is the implication that becoming aware, that you're in a better position to untie the knot? I mean, I'm just not understanding how the action of untying a knot, even mentally, starts to happen.
This is a really good question. First of all, most of our knots are habitual. They're not even accessible to our consciousness. For example, my knot, which was arrogance, I had no idea. You could have sat me down in a quiet room for hours and said, where are your problems? And I'd say, well, maybe sexual desire, or maybe I'm too smart, I'm not. But I would never come up with, you're full of yourself. And so it's like, when I'm talking about this, the easy ones are the ones that are almost not holding us because we can catch them. It's the ones that we don't see that require either a really good teacher, like a doctor, who just goes in and says, I didn't even notice, da-da-da. Or a practice where you start precepting yourself, refraining from harming yourself and others, watching over your actions to make sure they're not harmful or confused. And by doing that, you get a certain lighter energy, so that then when you do a meditation practice, these deeper things start to reveal themselves. But unless you still those waters a little bit with your body, mouth, and mind, our habit energy is like this swirl of distraction. And our habits are reinforced by our lifestyle that keeps us from facing them. So the interesting thing is that we're walking, but we're walking in circles. And we're busy, but we're busy covering over rather than revealing. So most of it, when it talks about what living beings are doing, most of our daily activity is a state of anxious-driven seeking and denial. And when the denial stuff starts to come up, instead of responding to it like, whoa, there's something I need to pay attention to, we deny it, cover it over, or try to dull our consciousness, through drinking, through television, through distraction, divertissement, as the French say. So our habit energies not only are hidden from us, but we have mechanisms defensively built up to keep us from even spotting them. The ego is a really masterful thing, how it works. So only by precepting yourself and changing your lifestyle a little bit and getting out of diversions and distractions and getting sober at every level are you able to bring enough light to bear to be able to see those knots. Now, the interesting thing is, the text is very good about this. It says, that sea of knots or suffering is vast, but a turning of the head, the turning of awareness to spot it, is already the other shore. It's, in other words, as soon as you even see the beginning of it, it's going to change. You got it. And then how much time it takes is not relevant, because once you start working on that knot, but before you actually see it, there's no other shore. There's nothing. So there's where patience is required, but patience only works if you get a good theory, if you got a good method. If you know this method is good and true, and if I work on it gradually, because bottom line is we don't want to be knotted up. Now, we are knotted up, and sometimes we're not aware, and we think the knots are kind of working in our favor, but when we're alone and quiet with ourselves, we know that this is, a kind of desperate bargain, a Faustian deal, we put ourselves into. We're getting this, and yet the knots are still there. Now, we can go out and put on a cheery face or whatnot, but again, alone with oneself, just realize, the mass of people live lives of quiet desperation, as Thoreau said. It's true. So then, when you start to see those, that very scene is already your avenue of exit. It's your escape thing, because now that you've seen it, you won't. It's like, okay, I caught you. I saw you there. I'm going to get you, and you just go after it. And what's amazing is as you start to unravel it, you realize it has a lot of hyper strength that isn't really there at all. And as the text says, fundamentally it's empty. What? It's fundamentally non-existent. It's a conditioned dharma. And the only reason it stays knotted is because you work on keeping it tight. It wants to unloosen. But our habitual way is I better tighten my knots today. I'm going out and get my ego into the world again. Tighten this knot, get the, like these sailboats. Everything's ready to go. He's like, I'm ready for the world. You're just this tight knotted bundle. Somebody says, let go, relax. No way, man, And so we go through our lives wasting our energy projecting this self out that nobody actually gives a damn about. They don't care. You think, I put on a good presentation today. Who saw it? Nobody notices. We're all in mirrors of our own, we're all looking at ourselves, and we're wondering, how did the crowd react? They're not even looking at us. And if they're applauding because they want something from you, not because they're happy at what you're projecting. So you gotta kind of realize this, no matter how hard you try, nobody cares. Maybe your mother. There's a sense of the mother's unconditioned love, but, eventually that goes away. And if you have if you have a tiger mom, it's not unconditional. She does applaud, and then also she scolds. But it's not necessarily for your liberation as much as for whatever she brings to it. So it's complicated. But we waste a lot of time trying to hold these knots up. And we can feel it. It manifests physiologically. A lot of our psychosomatic ailments, including, stress, hypertension, I think a lot of what we call the autoimmune breakdowns and whatnot are the result of tying and holding and blocking. And we think we're making our way. We're out there crisp and confident, but it takes a toll. We're exhausted at the end of the day. We look so forward to our vacation, but the habitual knots are so strong that even our vacation, we just tie more knots. We can just go someplace where we're having recreational knots instead of occupational knots. But they're knots nonetheless. I was remembering when Hung Sure and I were doing the bowing pilgrimage on the highway, we noticed like Monday morning, vroom, 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 coffee, people commuting back and forth to work in Los Angeles. Whoa, wow. I thought, oh God, it's like Friday night, it's gonna come, and think, the weekend. Finally we can bow the highway. Saturday morning, boom, 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 boom. Everybody going out to have a good time, to relax. Get out of my way, I gotta get, we're like, oh God, it's gonna rain, my vacation, it's like, so the stress went from the workday to the weekend and then back to the workday. And some people, we talked to some people, they were working on these jobs in LA so they could get enough money to buy a little cabin in Carmel area or in Big Sur, and then frantically trying to get there. And by the time they get there, it was late Saturday with all the traffic. And they get there and they crash, totally exhausted. They wake up Sunday morning, have a little breakfast or something, and they're like, oh, we got to head back to LA. And so the cabin would then sit there for 5 days while they slaved away to put money into the cabin that they never got to and enjoy. And finally the termites got a hold. It's like, you got to watch out because you can get yourself tied up in so many ways. And the Lotus Sutra says, and because we're confused, we use suffering to try to end suffering in this way. So the meditation is nothing more than the beginning basis to say, I'm going to stop. This frantic passage is not working. I'm going to stop and take a look at things. And not stop to escape, but just to examine these knots. And the amazing thing is once you start to untie it, it gets easier. You untie one, the next one's easier, the next one's easier. You get a pattern going. Moreover, the reward is immediate. I'm hedonistic. I'm a hedonistic Buddhist. In other words, I don't do this with the idea, I'm going to cross my legs and sit in pain and suffer, suffer, suffer. And then when I die, Buddha's going to say, good job, you earned it, here you go up to the Pure Land. No, that's not for me. I got to have some immediate feedback or reward, or I'm not going to continue. But as soon as you even loosen the knot, the joy that comes from that is irreplaceable. And you will go and go and go. And sometimes it's so powerful when it happens, you cry. The first time you confront one of these knots, whatever it is that you've attached to, and you start to loosen it, there's a release of tears. And I think this is not so much sadness, it's both sadness and joy. Sadness, how long have I held on to this? And joy at how good it feels to let go again. And it's a remembering of your true self. It's not like, oh, I've gone out to ecstasy. It's almost like, it's been there all along. I could have let go. I could have relaxed. Why am I waiting so long to do this? So in that sense, I don't know if that answers a long answer to your question, but I think, one, you have to recognize that it's going to take a while because the deepest ones are most strongly protected. Not only we have Bajra bouncers, tough guys around all that, we got lawyers too. We got the whole thing. So even if you get past the hard guys, then the lawyers will go, yeah, don't worry about it. It's like a small thing. Don't pay attention. Everybody's getting like this and that. You'll really get sick if you go in there, man. You're going to need a therapist. And they just like, that's the voice, and you just have to say, no, life is short. There's nothing else to do. I think I'm going to do this. I'm going to go into my own mind ground and see what's happening. Oops. Then the lawyers are no longer in retention. The bodyguards put down their Vajra thing, and you go and you find it's just a whimper little voice there. My metaphor is it's the Wizard of Oz. You pull the curtains button on, there he is, just working the bells and whistles. And so once you discover that, you can go after all of them. And this is the meaning from wonder to wonder, existence opens. It just keeps going. So just do it. Okay, good question. Any announcements? Nothing? Nobody's here to announce anything. Because there's nothing to attain, so there's nothing to announce, nothing to do. They just started a 3-week bowing session at the City of 10,000 Buddhas, and that's 3 weeks in a row. They go through an exercise of bowing. And some of you may find this really strange that I would advocate it, but I will say this, if you're seriously interested in cultivating, keep up your meditation and do it daily, but consider adding 10 or 15 minutes a day of bowing. And I can talk about this later, how to do it, not so much bowing to a Buddha, but bowing to the Buddha within and getting to look at the knots, because that's really what it's about. But it's a really good practice to add to balance with the sitting meditation. Okay, we're going to do a transference in English. people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity. May our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.